I'm Scott Masson here with Paideia Today with my colleague, Dr. Bill Friesen. Today for our podcast, we're going to be switching gears a little bit and moving towards a rather different form of literature than those that we've discussed before. We're looking at the Anglo-Saxon poem Beowulf, and I'll hand it over to Dr. Friesen here and let him do a little reading for us, I believe.
Yes, I've got the introduction to Beowulf. As you know, having looked at epics already, they tend not to be coy about what they're going to be talking about right at the beginning of the poem, so there's no enigma about it. But I'm going to give it to you in Old English initially, and then maybe I'll give you a translation here.
Ha!
What? We yardena en yardaiom theod keninga frumje frunon, hutha athelengus ellen fremedon. Oft schuldschefing sheathanath reatum, moine yamaithum me old settler ofteach, ed soda jorlas, suden erest werth, verschaft funden, he thas frofra jabad weox, under wolpnum, weort myndum thach. O that him achwilla thara setendra, o verschron rada hier en schulde, gomben gilden, that was good tuning. Those are the first 14 lines of Beowulf. And of course, if you don't know that much about the history of the English language, and I told you that was Old English, you might have expected that I would begin talking in something that sounded vaguely Shakespearean, but of course...
Or Chaucerian, yeah.
Or Chaucerian at best. But no, Old English is effectively, to the modern listener, an entirely foreign language.
Interestingly, Bill, I read it when I was in Germany, when I was at that point fluent in German, and I found it, I could understand it actually from German with a few helps in terms of words and so forth. So for Germans, it's easier, but I would say it's still not the equivalent of reading Chaucer. It's foreign language again.
No, these are radically different languages between Old English, Middle English, Shakespearean English, and Modern English. I'll come back. I'll talk about that very briefly later on. But like you, I had a bit of a background. I mean, nowhere close to the levels of German that you studied. You're actually a registered translator of German with the German government, whereas my knowledge of German is much more that of a dilettante. But nevertheless, I was studying German at the time that I was also studying Old English. And moreover, I was taught Old English by a, quite frankly, very spooky Jesuit individual, one of the most humorless men I've ever met. In fact, anybody who specializes in dead languages tends to be socially struggling, let's say. Anyway, and along with teaching us Old English, he taught us a lot of the basics of etymology and morphology and things like this, which was invaluable alongside the German. So if you knew how language evolved and you knew your German, and you knew your Old English, things would connect again and again. And so let's look at the first line there. What? There's a word that has evolved after that into hark. That's what it becomes. It means listen up. So essentially, this is the poet basically banging on the table saying, listen, the tale is beginning, shut up. We is we. Yardena. Yar is the Germanic word, the ancient Germanic word for spear, and it's also the root of the name Gary. So if you run into a Gary is a spear. Dana is, of course, related to the Danes, spear Danes. In, the preposition is the same as it always was. Yar is year. Diom is day. Days of yore is usually how we translate that sort of thing. So very briefly, let me give you also an English translation. I've translated this myself, but I'm not quite so pompous as to foist that upon you. I prefer, you and I were discussing this before the podcast, I prefer literal translations to what they call sense for sense translations. Literal translations, I believe, involve a lot more integrity, a lot more rigor. And they're not so much about the translator. A lot of times when I read sense for sense translations, the translator implies his or her meaning upon the text and his or her worldview upon the text. That's fine and good. If I want to talk to the translator, I'll talk to the translator in a conversation over coffee. But I don't want it in the translated form. Rather, what I want is the voice of a long dead author and his worldview. So this is the one that typically I go to. This is John Porter's literal translation. It's
Right.
cheap. It's not very well known, sadly.
Whereas I use the Seamus Heaney translation in my
Yeah,
classes.
I have that right here as
Yeah.
well. This is the Seamus Heaney with the chain-mailed guy on the front. It's not bad,
No, it's
actually.
pretty good.
It's pretty solid. So Heaney spent a long time studying Old English simply in order to produce his own poetic form of it. But the bottom line is, anytime you have a
Kudos to him for that, I'll have to
yeah,
say.
it's a
Yeah.
lot of discipline, and I love that. But anyway, I'll give you those same 14 lines here that I just read you, but now translated by Porter. What? We spear Danes in your days, tribe kings glory heard, how the prince's courage accomplished. Oft Schuld, Sheaf's son, from the enemy's bands, from many tribes, mead benches seized, terrorized earls, since first he was destitute found. He its relief knew, grew under skies, in honors throve, until to him each neighbor over the Whale road must submit, must tribute yield. That was a good king. So that's what you encounter right at the beginning of Beowulf. Now, the reason Beowulf is such a big deal in English studies, and it's not being taught in a lot of universities anymore. In fact, I would say probably minimum 3/4 of the large universities in the Western world nowadays no longer teach Beowulf at all. You're lucky to encounter Chaucer, who's hundreds of years later, and coming from a completely different worldview. The reason Beowulf, I would argue, is kind of a big deal is because it is the earliest major work in English that has survived down to us. This is going right down to the taproots of what has survived. You can't get any further back. As the Iliad in the West is the oldest thing we have. Make an argument there about the Epic of Gilgamesh, I suppose. But in Northwestern cultures, this is as old as it gets. And it is also an absolute masterwork. And we're going to come back. We'll talk about that
Yeah.
maybe today, maybe in a later podcast. But the sheer richness of the text itself is difficult to overemphasize, as it is with the Aeneid, the Odyssey, the Iliad, and so on. It is again one of these texts. It makes allusions and references to other great epics. It existed in a great matrix of Germanic epics, overwhelmingly which have now been lost, sadly, but this is the way it goes. Now we also need to make a little bit of a distinction when it comes to medieval texts in particular. I suppose this would be the case with ancient texts as well, between the date of the composition on the one hand and the date of the manuscript on the other. Scholars are still ferociously debating the date when this was composed. We've got only one datable element in it. I'll talk about that in just a second briefly. But the dates usually that we have for composition run anywhere from as early as 700 AD to as late as 1020 AD.
That's a pretty big range.
Yes, a massive range. Just basically in the entire English Anglo-Saxon period.
It's basically scholars throwing their hands up saying,
yeah, we have no clue. My inclination is that it is earlier rather than later, but I'm not a manuscript specialist. I'm also not a language specialist, in spite of what some people might think. But I will say that, yeah, I tend to go back to the earlier dates, thinking somewhere around 750 or so. It seems plausible, but that's just my best guess, and that's all I've got, a guess.
yeah.
We do know, however, with much more certainty when the manuscript was written, and that's around 1010, essentially.
Before the Norman invasion.
Correct. The Norman invasion, of course, is 1066, the famous, or if you're me, infamous Battle of Hastings.
Yeah.
And it was collected by these humanists that you and I talked about. In this case here, a Robert Bruce Cotton was scouring libraries and archives all over England and northwestern Europe to see what he could recover of English literary inheritance. And this is one of the texts that he located. He found it in something called the Noel Codex, which is a collection of 4 different works, including Beowulf. And what makes that codex interesting is the fact that all the pieces of literature in there regard monsters.
What is a codex, Bill, for the sake of our listeners?
Yeah, it's simply a collection of manuscripts. So you'll find, it's usually you got a hard binding on either side, made out of wood, oftentimes coated in leather. Usually they try to use beech trees for that, which is where we get our word book from, by the way. Betch is the Old English, B-E-C. And then you've got vellum inside for the manuscripts themselves, made out of sheep's skins, or if you're poor, goat skins. So it takes a lot of dead sheep to make a book. And it also contributes very significantly to the cost of a book. Oxford Library in the Middle Ages was one of the biggest libraries in the European world and had only 13,000 texts in it. And to a modern library, that's laughable. But back then it was a wonder. And this is one of the reasons. The making of a book was just
exorbitant.
Oh my goodness, yeah. Anyway, we nearly lost it. Robert Cotton, he located it and he brought it together in his library, the Cotton Library, which he decided he would set up in a place called the Ashburnham House. And you'll never guess what happened to the Ashburnham House.
I'll never guess, Bill. Tell me what happened at the Ashburnham. That's like a punchline to a joke. What happened at the Ashburnham House, Bill?
Yeah, it caught on fire like everything caught on fire back then. And it went up in flames. And some library, this was back when librarians were truly heroic, and they ran in there and they were literally grabbing armloads of burning books and hurled them out of the window into the street.
as one does.
As one does. And this is why, if you go to look at the actual manuscript of Beowulf to this very day, you'll see all around the edges it's charred. This is why it's charred. It's
they don't make librarians the way they used to.
No, indeed. No, indeed. Genuinely heroic, and not to mention now fire-scarred men, one assumes. In any event, the manuscript shows signs of not having been well respected for a long time. Not only is it obviously charred around the edges, it also has been used as a cutting board on at least 3 occasions. One time we know it was used to cut cheese, and the other 2 times it was used to cut bread. And the striations are still, you can see them across the actual manuscript itself. Other times people thought to themselves, oh, I have this wonderful piece of furniture. I don't want to get a beer stain on it. I will use this book as a coaster. So you've got 2 mug rings from ale on the Beowulf manuscript as well.
I'm glad they were ale at least.
Yes, there's something to that at least.
Although mead might have been appropriate given the context. But
yeah, but I'm thinking the later audiences weren't quite so posh as mead.
That's true. Yeah. But in terms of reception, Bill, I can't recall any reference to Beowulf in my readings. I'm not the medievalist that you are, but even the Renaissance, was it a text that was known?
It was known, but it was known in specialist circles.
I mean, even by by other poets, references and so forth.
Not in any way.
I'm not talking about scholars now. I'm talking about, was it in the literary tradition? Did it have its influence on other authors? And I'm struggling to think of any influence.
You would struggle. No. The Ben Jonsons, the John Donnes, the Shakespeares, the Alexander Popes.
Nothing, right?
They knew something of it, but they knew it as basically as a linguistic and literary curiosity.
Right.
The medieval text that actually exerts a fair bit of influence on the on the Renaissance imagination is probably Chaucer. Yeah. Chaucer was one of the first authors who was treated by the printing press later on. And this contributed very significantly to the fame of Chaucer. And then, of course, Spencer came along and celebrated things sort of in that vein and passed certain tendencies on.
Yeah.
I'll come back. I'll talk about that in just a minute. I should talk very briefly about the language again, and then I'll leave that behind. There are 4 usual phases we talk about with the English language, and Old English, which I just read to you, is the earliest form of the language. And I tell people, when they say that's not English, I will tell them, look, insofar as we're getting closer and closer to the roots, the genuine, authentic roots of English, this is more English than what you're speaking today in some senses. It's less, quote unquote, corrupted. But Old English gets wiped out almost at a stroke in 1066 with the Battle of Hastings. When the Normans conquered England, they wiped out the Anglo-Saxon hierarchy at the level of government, at the level of military, at the level of church, at the level of intellectual endeavor, at the level of everything. Everybody was out, and they replaced all those people with a matrix of Normans. The Normans themselves, as perhaps you already know, are descended from the Vikings, but have been naturalized with Frankish, that is to say French culture. So you see the rise of Anglo-Norman, and this is what gets preserved in texts up until about 1300. Everywhere you go. And it's kind of a dialect, often mocked dialect of French. And then we see the rise of Middle English, because Old English never went away. It just went
Yeah.
underground.
So it was the commoners who spoke English and the aristocrats that spoke this
Yes. So
Norse. Yeah.
80–90% of people in England were still speaking Old English after the conquest. In time, as happens again and again, the Normans themselves were assimilated into this culture. They became naturalized into it. And so Anglo-Norman fades away, and we see the rise of this thing called Middle English. And this is the language of Chaucer.
Hmm.
And the dates for when Middle English morphs into Shakespearean English, which is the third phase, are debatable. I usually place it somewhere around 1450 or so, 1475, I guess, at the very latest. And you see the great vowel shift. You and I will talk about that in later episodes. And we move into Shakespearean English, which is obviously the language of Shakespeare, the thee, thous, and thine, and all that stuff, which so many people erroneously think is Old English. It's emphatically not. It's 2 stages removed. And then finally, around 1660, most linguists agree that's where we move into modern English as we speak it today, as we the syntax, the pronunciation, all these sorts of things. So those are your 4 phases. Those are the dates, roughly, when it comes to English.
Hmm.
But let's back up a step here or two about it being respected or disrespected. You wanted to say something about how it
Well, we
seems
talked about
it seems to have
genre.
been, yeah, in terms of genre, in terms of its neglect by, as a genuinely literary text, and all this stuff.
Well, I mean, I do actually teach it to my first year undergrads, and then it's not even in many anthologies anymore, so it speaks to what you've just said. But when I do so, I tend to present it as an epic, and we've just done a series of epics. We've looked at the Iliad, the Odyssey, the Aeneid. In many ways, this is epic in its scope, but it doesn't bear some of the marks of the epic that I would recognize as conventions of the epic, and it doesn't even acknowledge the authors in a way that certainly the secondary epic, as we just spoke of, did in reference to Homer. And the man who brought almost single-handedly, and you'll say more about this, this text to the not just the attention but to the estimation of the English-speaking world, J.R.R. Tolkien, he argues that this is a heroic elegiac poem, not an epic, since he's the expert on it, and he's also the one responsible for bringing it to such prominence. It's hard not to be stopped in one's tracks and says, okay, well, it's not an epic. But let's dig down on what he calls it then, a heroic elegiac poem. My comment is, what the heck is that? Because I don't recognize that as a genre of literature per se. It has those features for certain. Really, he's saying it's Northern European and not Southern European. But does that make it not an epic?
I think Tolkien actually, in probably the most important work on Beowulf that he wrote, The Critics and the Monsters, actually undermines himself to some extent. Tolkien is thinking out loud to some extent. There it is. That's a wonderful text that pays massive.
Monsters and the Critics. Yeah.
That's right. Along with another piece here that is invaluable. This was written by my PhD advisor,
Andy Orchard.
companion, yeah, Andy Orchard, who is now the Bosworth and Rawlinson Chair of Anglo-Saxon over at Oxford, which is the chair that, of course, Tolkien himself used to hold. In fact, was created largely so that they might house Tolkien at Oxford. Anyway, Tolkien mentions in The Critics and the Monsters, when he's talking about the monsters themselves, that the monsters of the Germanic, that is to say the English, as well as all sort of cognates, imagination, are different fundamentally than the monsters we encounter in, let's say, the Odyssey or something like this.
We're going to talk about that next time, right?
Yeah, the next podcast, we're going to really focus on the monsters. But he says that the terms and the description and the discussion and the treatment of the monsters in Germanic works almost has more of a sense of an adjective than a noun. They connote monstrousness. They approach you in a certain spirit or mood, and that's the most important takeaway from the monster. You will see with the giants, with the dragons, with the trolls, with all these monsters that you encounter, they seldom give you hard, concrete details. So next episode, we're going to talk about Grendel's infamous raid on the Mead Hall. And what does Grendel look like? We don't know. He's got scaly sort of skin, which iron can't bite, which is a phrase used typically of berserkers, by the way. And he's got
Interesting.
eyes of flame in the dark, and that's all you see is Grendel seeing you, which is creepy as hell. I see you, and so all you see is the monster seeing you,
A
and
bit
that's
like Sauron, right?
yes, yes. And that's a deliberate tactic, and of course, yeah, Tolkien uses that in The Lord of the Rings to great effect. He never gives you hard form of the most terrifying things in there oftentimes.
Mm.
Anyway, we're going to come back and talk about this also around the dragon and whatnot. But the same holds for genre, as you were saying. The Germanic mind is much less inclined to categorize analytically what it's doing in terms of its literature. So if you said, is this the genre of epic, or is this an elegy, or what is this? Your Anglo-Saxon poet, known as a shop or a shaper, would very likely just shrug and say, look, is it good or is it bad? I mean, why do you need to step back and analyze it? I mean, engage with the text itself and stop talking about categories, which is foreign to my mind, sadly.
Well, it's foreign to the Greek mind. It's foreign to the medieval mind, really. Which
Yeah.
is ironic since we're talking about medievals. But the medieval mind, they are categorizers. That's what they do.
Yeah.
Right?
When we get to later, I mean, later works, this is discussed to great effect in C.S. Lewis's Tolkien's Friends, Discarded Image, one of the most valuable reads. It's a short read. If you don't have much time and you really want to get a little more cultured, especially in the Western tradition, it's a short, accessible read. Pick it up and read. It's like De Poetica. It's short, it's accessible, it's just a must read. So there's two texts that should be immediately on your reading list. Anyway, so calling it a heroic elegy, I mean, you can say, anachronistically, you can turn on your heel and say, look, there are features here that bear striking similarities to the epics which are traditionally accepted that we've been discussing. You've got a hero figure at the center. You've got grand, sublime, huge action. Its treatment of that action bears certain similarities. It's the big stuff. You don't get much minutia or stuff like this. Chaucer, famously, in his Canterbury Tales, he has a little detail that I like where I think it's the miller who's about to tell his tale, or maybe it's the reeve. It doesn't really matter. And he's going to sit down to tell the tale. And Chaucer mentions in his poem that he shoos this black cat off the bench as the teller of the tale sits down. It's a detail you'll never get in Beowulf. It's way too minute. It's all about setting the mood and what have you for Chaucer. The mood is totally different in Beowulf. So the treatment is big and grand and all these sorts of things. You get a hero figure at the center, as you say. A lot of people include this notion of a journey to the realm of the dead as a necessary element of what's going on here. You have that, but in very strange form in Beowulf when he swims down to the bottom of the mere and he goes into the grotto where Grendel's mother dwells. And of course, in some senses, she is dead because she is the kin of Cain and they've been wiped out. But she's still living, but doesn't seem to know it. But she's still beneath the waves that killed her kin.
She has her dead son with her, right?
She has her dead son with her. And what is she killed by? She's killed by this sword, which has in ekphratic detail on the hilt, and we'll talk about this more next podcast, the flood narrative on it. So the sword is the flood, and the flood ultimately does kill her, but in metaphorical sword form. But it is nevertheless the realm of the dead to which Beowulf goes, and where he barely manages to return. And not by his own powers either.
No.
Which, well, we'll talk about that stage by stage.
So that seems rather epic in many ways, right?
So, I mean, we could go on listing these sorts of things, but yeah, there's a lot of the epic in here. On the other hand, is it different? Is it elegiac? There's another anachronistic term. They wouldn't know what you're talking about if you mentioned that.
No. That's a Greek term again.
Yes, exactly. Elegiac poetry, which is a form of one of the three forms of lyric poetry that the Greeks practiced. Anyway, and based on the actual metrical structure of the poem, not its content or mood, which is how we talk about it later on in English when we get into the 18th century. Is there something deep and mournful which is distinctive about Anglo-Saxon poetry? Yes, for the most part there is. It is typically, and I'm generalizing here, it is a sad, introspective, majestic kind of a poetry. The language itself, Tolkien famously asserted, and I agree wholeheartedly with him, the very spirit of the language itself, grammatically, auditorially, and all these sorts of things, poetically, is slow and sonorous and mournful. And I mean, we start off Paideia Today with this kind of deep cello that, runs through things. That kind of catches some of it. It really does.
Yes.
And if you
Yes.
listen to Old Norse, which is a very closely related language that could actually probably have spoken to one another when the Vikings first invaded the Anglo-Saxon island, they would have had some sense of what the other guy was saying, because Germanic languages back then were very close. But nevertheless, the point is made, again by Tolkien, that the spirit of Old Norse is very different. He says, you got the slow, majestic Old English language. And on the other hand, Old Norse, he said, when it tries to communicate its meaning, it's like a fist to the eye, I think is what Tolkien said. It just hits you with what it means to say. And its brilliance is in its directness. There's an actual artistry to shocking directness. And Old Norse poetry and literature does that extremely well. I'm trying to think of a line off the
I beg your pardon.
But you can hear immediately that's a different kind of a language.
Yeah.
The translation of that being, when you see evil, speak you there straight out at that evil and never give the devil a peace treaty. That's what I just said. Anyway, very, very different language than Old English. So is there anachronistically something of the elegiac about Old English? Yeah. Tolkien's not wrong. I'm not saying Tolkien is wrong.
So how is that because of the cultural context that influences the Beowulf poem? Like, what are your thoughts here?
Well, this is one of the curious things about Beowulf. Beowulf is composed, I should say, by a Christian author looking back. They are very much a people who look back in sadness, fondness, respect, reverence. And there is a great tradition, not even a literary or poetic tradition. There's a great tradition of culture there. And the poet is very clearly at pains to see this go as time moves on and Christianity comes in. And so some people have argued that he's trying to assimilate that pagan culture into his Christian worldview. Some people argue that it's a fond goodbye or something like this. But what we need to remember here is that when it comes to the conversion of the Anglo-Saxon to Christianity, and we don't have time for or scope for this in this podcast, there is no example of Christian conversion which is more committed to assimilating rather than replacing the culture it encounters. And it does this everywhere. Probably the best text to read on this is in Bede's History of the English Church and People. And he records famously there what is known as the Libellus Responsiosum, the Book of Questions, where there are 10 questions that the arch converter of the Anglo-Saxons, Augustine of Canterbury, to be confused with Augustine of Hippo, sends to Pope Gregory the Great in Rome, somewhere around a little after 597. And he asks the Pope a number of questions, many of which are stupid questions, about what he's to do with these pagan Anglo-Saxons. And he says, what do I do with their holidays and what do I do with their temples? Do I burn them down and do I eradicate them? And Gregory's like, no, are you an idiot? I sent you to do a good job of this here and you need to turn your brain on. So they're used to worshiping at these temples. So don't tear them down, take all the idols and stuff out of them, consecrate them to God's purpose, and then turn them into churches. And this is an example already that's being used from the Mediterranean world, of course. They convert many temples to pagan gods into churches. And then they usually dedicate that church to a saint of some kind who has a lot of similarities to the god who was worshipped there before. So oftentimes Church of St. Michael is a common one in the northern world. St. Michael goes out to fight the dragon at the end.
Right.
And so does Thor. At the Ragnarök, he goes out to fight the Middle Earth serpent, the Mythias Ormur. So this is an immediate crossover. So oftentimes really old churches in England that are dedicated to St. Michael had been, on those grounds formerly, had been a temple to the god Thor, or Donner, or however you want to know him.
Fascinating.
Yes, and they do the same thing with holidays. Do I get rid of their holidays? No, don't do that. They're used to celebrating, their rights and what have you at this time. Just take them and convert them. Take them and convert them. Take them and convert them. So Yule, what we now call Christmas, says take that and convert that to, the birth of Christ and all the things that go along with that. Easter, which is a celebration to the goddess Eostra, usually involving human sacrifice, according to Tacitus. He says, turn that into notions of our Easter, our modern notions of Easter and Christ's sacrifice on the cross, convert that. So they convert the language, they convert the holidays, they convert the churches, and they convert the literature as well. And so we see this process of careful, detailed, extremely intelligent conversion of a pagan poetic tradition in Beowulf to a Christian tradition, but with a lot of mournful, cautious treatment on the part of the anonymous poet.
That's just so fascinating, because when you think of conversion, often in Christian terms, in terms of a personal transformation, it is the language is out of a new birth, right?
Yes.
So there's nothing of the old left. There is a new creature, right? When you're come to faith in Christ, that's what happens. There's a new birth that's taken place. Whereas the conversion of a culture isn't quite the same thing. It is not that the old is passed away. It's that the old is being transformed and reshaped. And again, I think we referred to this when we talked about De Doctrina Christiana, Augustine's analogy for plundering the Egyptians and using their gold and their good things and removing their connections with idolatry and demonic worship, which he, as he called it, and then but utilizing it for proper worship. So that's the difference in terms, and so that's a helpful distinction here as well. When we're talking about conversion, there's a distinction between a personal conversion and a cultural conversion, right?
Yeah.
And in a cultural conversion, you seek to preserve what was good and integral about the culture. Whereas in a
Exactly.
personal conversion, you really are a new creature, and that is rather different.
Yeah, it's because the Anglo-Saxons were so keen on this notion of conversion of what had gone before. We have a linguistic survival of all things Old English, especially with the language and the literature, which is not matched by any other culture in Northwestern Europe. This is the great stop. If you want to see what was before, this is where you go. So we have
So what
radically more literature. The Germans have almost no survival of their prior literature prior to their conversion, which, by the way, happened at the behest of Anglo-Saxon missionaries.
Okay, so the other, so as a non-specialist here, Bill, I'm going to just talk about a few things that always occur to me, and maybe you can respond to it. So comparing to the Greco-Roman epics, there seems to be different features of the characters here. So in the Iliad, the Odyssey, there's a hierarchy, there are princes and so forth, and it's not that they don't prize loyalty, because they do, but it seems far more prominent here in this work. Loyalty seems to be almost all. Say something about that. Am I wrong in that?
No, you're not wrong. It's Tacitus, actually, the Roman historian, writing right around the life of Christ, actually, talks in two different sources about the qualities of the Germanic barbarians, amongst whom we have to list the Anglo-Saxons. And he says, we've got our set of virtues. We've got the 4 virtues that we have over here as Romans. He says, but the Germanic people have their own set, which kind of crosses over into ours. They value courage, but it's the courage of a very different species than we've encountered in Greek and Roman epic, and we're going to talk about that later. They value generosity, but a generosity which is not merely material. There's a generosity of spirit, he says, about these people that you will not find amongst people in the Roman Empire. Now, remember here, he's writing these texts, Germania, and I think it's Agricola as well, as very much as reformatory historical texts to chastise the Roman people. So he might be characterizing the Germanic barbarians in positive ways in order to shame the Romans. I don't know.
Yeah, he's over egging the pudding, to
Yeah,
use the phrase.
exactly, exactly. And then the third thing he talks about is loyalty. He says, they are loyal as we are not. We feel the obligation of loyalty as Romans as kind of an external, public, imposed upon virtue that there's a code and you need to adhere to it. Whereas amongst the Germanic barbarians, that loyalty is much more organic, and it arises from a deep love for the leader, and it's reciprocal.
The Romans appeal to patriotism. The Germans feel it, and it's a genuine love for their leader.
Yeah, you'll see this in at numerous points in Beowulf's relation with Hugh Yelak and so on and so forth, and Hrothgar's relationship with his people. You follow your leader because you admire him as a person, and you have a deep affection for this person. That's why you will fight to the death with this person. You see this, we discussed this with the Praetorian Guard, and how they were, these Germanic barbarians were converted to Roman military sort of standards, dressed up in Roman uniforms with Roman weapons. But the bottom line is they didn't speak Latin for the most part. And they were still operating according to these codes of loyalty. And this is loyalty to the death. And numerous professors in various fields, sociology, anthropology, medievalists, and what have you, with their addiction to deconstructing, have tried to deconstruct these codes of loyalty as an anachronistic construct or a purely literary construct or what have you. But historical details seem to reinforce rather than disperse.
Undermine, yeah.
Yeah, so we see the Battle of Malden, where Birchnoth is surrounded by, I mean, some of his thanes flee to their lifelong infamy. But he's got a core of people around him who after Birchnoth falls in battle, his retainers, out of loyalty, rather than run, they die around him. There's a ring of his dead followers around him. At the Battle of Hastings, Harold Godwinson, he's struck down. And he's got a large set of retainers, the inner men. You usually have a guard, if you're in Germanic culture, of retainers around you.
Yeah.
And that's what we refer to them as, by the way. And we know that they died in large numbers around them, even when they had the opportunity to flee. They could have run. Yeah. They did not. And we think hundreds of them died around.
So that's very interesting. And in some ways, it strikes me, it seems more amenable, at least in terms of a temperament and in terms of a personal relation, that suits a Christian view of what a Christian ought to be in some ways, as opposed to the individualistic, factionalistic, very political Greek world, and even to some degree the Roman world. I mean, the Roman world is about duty, but duty there almost seems to be, again, the Stoic temperament of a virtue that you put on rather than you actually feel, whereas the Germanic really does have a more, as you say, an organic inclination there.
Yeah, we draw a very clear line between the early Middle Ages, or the Dark Ages, if you like, and the High Middle Ages, based usually around 1066, for a number of reasons. But this is one of the reasons. We see the rise of feudalism in the High Middle Ages, and we'll talk about that in later podcasts as well. Feudalism is your pledging of your fealty to a lord, whether he's a duke or a baron or a marquis or whatever it is, doesn't matter. And again, it is almost antithetical to this notion of loyalty that we're discussing here. It is something that is imposed extraneously. There is a code. Everyone knows the code. Whether you feel it or not, you are obligated to your lord. It's a much more one-way relationship. It's you giving to the Lord instead of two ways, which it is very much here. And so we go back to that model you're talking about. It's a litigious model. It's not a felt model. In some ways, some people have referred to it as a very artificial model of loyalty and obligation, obligé. And so we go back to that. And some people would argue that that is the lesser of two loyalties in terms of a model.
Is that why we see marks of, the vengeance and all of that sort of stuff in this?
Yeah, vengeance is, you can't understand early Germanic culture, whether it's Anglo-Saxon or Viking or what have you, without understanding the vengeance dynamic. The 20th century poet W.H. Auden talks about it as the world's only successful perpetual motion machine.
Vengeance.
He was fascinated with Icelandic literature, which is to say Viking literature. Anyway, the idea is that you have two different models of European vengeance codes. The first is what we typically refer to as the Southern Code, which is the vendetta. The vendetta is a code of revenge which arises out of a sort of a savage passion. You have to hate your victim. He has done something, she has done something to you or your family or your people or something.
So that's an Italian word. This is mafia. This is Italian.
That's
sentiment,
right. This is the realm of the stiletto through the eye and all that.
Right. So this is what we know from Hollywood films, basically.
Correct.
That's the vendetta.
Yeah. So it arises from the passions, and you kill in a sense of hate and sadism at times, and it's the passions have to really be in place for this to work. I think of the light opera, Carmina Burana. You catch a lot of the spirit of what's going on there with the vendetta. On the other hand, the Germanic code is in many ways the opposite. It is a code of vengeance, which is predicated upon oftentimes bleak and even mournful obligation. So we see in many of the tales, even in Old English, but also in Old Norse, where somebody, your kin group is largely what your loyalty is centered on. Your lord, usually a warlord or kuning, and your kin group. And hopefully these two things are bound up together, and that your kin group and your other obligations to your lord don't conflict, but rather align. But oftentimes they do not align. A lot of times people have to take vengeance. So somebody in your kin group or somebody amongst your people, your lord's group, your retainers, is harmed, insulted, or killed. And whether you like it or not, you have to avenge them. And the person upon whom you may have to avenge this death or this wrong is oftentimes somebody you may actually like quite a bit, but it doesn't matter. You have to kill them. And there's another sin that goes along with this, is breach of loyalty. If you break your loyalty and don't exert vengeance or try to exert vengeance for a wrong like this, in Germanic society, you are forever broken. You can no longer function as a person, as a member of that society. We encounter this with other poems which are even more elegiac in spirit. The Wanderer, for instance, gets into this, and how his lord and all his fellows fell at this horrible battle. Somehow he survived, and he can't impose vengeance, and now he wanders adrift in the world. He's a broken man. If you betray...
Tolkien's The Realm of the Dead there, where the oath breakers had not done their duty, and therefore they're cursed and they're forever tormented, although they be dead, until such time as they shall fulfill their oath. That sort of same sense then, just to
yeah. It's really difficult to overemphasize how broken you are if you break loyalty and fail to avenge a wrong or a death. You're just done. And this may explain one of the reasons why you find all these rings of dead loyal retainers around lords in Anglo-Saxon history and Anglo-Saxon literature.
So this is honor culture then, very strongly, and very much leans almost towards the East as well. Again, you get this in the samurai and other such martial societies.
Yeah, codes of Bushido and things like that. But I mean, there's a really interesting account. I'm not going to go into its details, in the Anglo-Saxon chronicles, where the chronicler actually thinks a certain cycle of vengeance so striking that he records it in detail, which usually isn't done in the Anglo-Saxon chronicle. It's a chronicle, so therefore the entries are very brief. In this year, these things happened, and then they move on. But here he gives you the full story of this code of loyalty holds to all levels of society. They don't have aristocratic society the way we think of it in later times during the High Middle Ages. The nobility of your blood does matter, but it doesn't transfer as a necessity. So there are times when certain individuals come to power and everyone says, this person who is the son of King so-and-so is a bit of a dud. We're going to pass him over and go with somebody much more promising who's actually got a track record in the field, and you're finished. So this happens all the time. It's very much a meritocracy. This is a ferocious meritocracy, this ruling sort of dynamic. Likewise, and we've been talking about loyalty. And one of the things I should also point out here is that if your lord and his people are not in a position of immediate duress, and he's not particularly promising, it was not uncommon for a retainer to say, you know what, nothing's happening here. I'm going to head out and pledge my loyalty to another guy who's doing a lot more stuff. There's much more chance of me gaining glory with that guy over there than with you here. And you could do that as long as, you weren't abandoning your lord in the lurch. That's not done. Whereas in the High Middle Ages, that's unthinkable. I mean, you have to even ask permission to leave the court, never mind leave the service of your lord. It's not done.
Yeah.
Whereas it is done here continuously in this culture.
Bill, I find this really interesting, but we've actually talked about this a great deal, and we've not even touched on some of the things we wanted to talk about the use of the language and the features of the language. And we also have not yet talked about the thing that I really wanted to get to talk about, namely the monsters. But perhaps we'd be better off leaving that to the next episode. At any rate, I'm Dr. Scott Masson with Dr. Bill Friesen here, and this is Paideia Today. And thank you much. We'll see you next time.
So take care.